Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, America. Good afternoon, Europe. And good evening, Lebanon. Wherever you are around the globe, welcome to Unheard Stories. I am Lubna Hassaniya, and I come to you from spectacular Southern California. Unheard Stories is a monthly event that is designed to bring communities together and shed light on the many journeys and legacies of success, creativity, and philanthropy. I am thrilled to have Nobel laureate Dr. Ardem Patapoutian as my guest today. Before we start this amazing conversation, I would like to take a few moments to recognize and welcome the dignitaries who are with us today. We have Ambassador Jean Macaron. We have Chargé d'Affaires Wael Hashim from the Embassy of Lebanon in DC. Consul General Bashir Sarkis from LA, Councilor Mirna Khawli, Honorary Consul Anthony Asher, Honorary Consul Joseph Maroon, and we also have Honorable Judge Tony Raphael with us. Today, we are gathered to celebrate a milestone in science and to be reminded of the power and the beauty of the human mind. Human ingenuity has no starting point, nor does it have an ending point. It is as vast as the universe that encompasses it. And only when we open our minds to this vastness can we tap into the abundance of knowledge available for us. The mechanosensors that Dr. Ardem Patapoutian set out to identify had eluded scientists for tens of years. They are cation channels that allow us to feel touch and pain, help us position our body within our environment, and play a role in the function of several internal organs as well. His fundamental contributions to science earned him the 2020 Kavli Prize in Neuroscience, and ultimately the 2021 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Dr. Patapoutian is a professor in the Department of Neuroscience and the Presidential Endowed Chair in Neurobiology at Scripps Research. He's also an investigator at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Dr. Patapoutian conducted his postdoctoral research at UC San Francisco, earned his PhD in biology from Caltech, and his BS in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology from UCLA. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Patapoutian in person at the ceremony of his decoration with the Lebanese National Order of Merit, presented to him by Chargé d'Affaires Wael Hashim on behalf of President Michel Aoun, the President of Lebanon. So without further ado, let's start the conversation with our Nobel laureate. Welcome to Unheard Stories, Dr. Patapoutian, and congratulations on your well-earned prize.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Yes, yes. Well, your name now belongs to the list of those, and to quote Alfred Nobel, who have conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. And the list includes Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, Sir Alexander Fleming, Watson and Crick, and that's to name a few. What does this prestigious recognition mean to you? One, on a personal level, and two, on a professional level?
Honestly, I'm still trying to process this. It has been 4 months since we heard the news, October 4, and ever since then, it's been a bit crazy. You don't know how many times while taking a walk with my wife, we asked each other, did this really happen? It's a bit surreal, but I guess it has happened. And as I said, what it means to me is an evolving answer, because I'm just learning of what this means to me, my colleagues, friends, and countrymen as we're going forward. So, I mean, at the professional level, the fact that my peers, scientists, nominated me, and committees in Stockholm decided to give the prize for this is truly remarkable. And both on the professional and the personal level, I feel like the greatest joy has been to see the joy of others. And all scientists know that the Nobel Prize is a big deal, but I don't think anyone realizes how much it means to people till you are on the receiving end. So the joy that I've felt through my students and postdoc ex-trainees, the institute research, Scripps research that I have worked at for 20 years, the whole field of ion channel studies or touch or pain sensation have all celebrated this as if it's their own.
Yes.
And this really gives the immense joy to me. And it's the same thing at the personal level. You can imagine my parents have always been proud of me, but this was of course a shock to them, and they're extremely proud and living it up, I would say, right now with what this means to them. And it's just, again, not my family. As you know, I'm of Armenian descent, and I was born and lived 18 years in Lebanon. So although I was not very closely associated with this anymore, just to see all Lebanese, for example, really celebrate with me has been truly remarkable. And it's made me rethink about my roots and reconnect in some ways. And so in that sense, it has been truly remarkable.
Yes, definitely. You have a substantial academic footprint. Your discovery is on its way to revolutionizing the way we treat many, many diseases and ailments. We will be talking about that in a little while. Well deserved. Dr. Patapoutian, you carry within you a past that extends generations. It is rich with Armenian heritage that your parents firmly held on to and immersed you in growing up. There was also the Lebanese heritage you were born into and grew up with. And when the Lebanese civil war forced you out of the country, you found yourself assimilating with yet a third culture, the American culture. How does this richness, this diversity in perspective, impact the way you interpret the world around you? And how much of an impact does it have on your success today?
And that's a very interesting question. I think at face value, just growing up in Lebanon during the Civil War, I was 8 years old in 1975 when the war began. And I think I, have taken from that strong sense of resilience and to be tough, and also not to take things for granted. When you're a kid and you're growing up in war, when it's not safe to go out at night, or you have to go to a bomb shelter when you hear bombs, all of this, there's a price and a consequence to this, but at the same time, you find little joys. Like I specifically remember, as scary as going to the basement of the building was in Beirut when bombs started falling, I also loved it because you got to see all the neighbors, you got to stay up at night when you're supposed to be sleeping. So this idea of making the most of things and celebrating the good stuff and being optimistic, I think kind of got ingrained in me. And of course, all of this is, very important in science. It's very easy to get depressed and down on yourself because of an unfunded grant or paper not being accepted. But it just is reminding yourself of what the important things are and finding joy in little things and persevering. Lots of parallels between my, again, upbringing and to make it in the sciences in a ways. But I should say that I'm so grateful for Lebanon for many reasons. Most and foremost, historically, my grandparents, due to the Armenian genocide, had to march into Lebanon, and the fact that Lebanon took us in and gave us citizenship, that's something we will never forget. And at the same time, when I came to the US and went to UCLA, both because of the Armenian culture and the Lebanese culture, where education is so valued. I had 1 year of American University of Beirut before I came here, and I felt lots of cultural shocks, but not educational shocks. So my education was so strong that I was able to immediately integrate and continue my education without this pressure of, oh my God, now we're in a different level.
Yes.
And finally, I think just, we talk a lot about diversity in society and in science specifically. And this is, again, I think another great example of the different cultures that I've brought, the different perspective, definitely helps, not just in science, in all of society. And that's why I'm a very firm proponent of encouraging diversity, not for the sake of encouraging diversity, but again, because it brings this different perspective to questions. And it's much more tangible within science when you change fields, for example. Again, you bring with you perspectives that people who've been studying the same thing the same way the last 20 years don't look at it that way. And lots of times that's a very important aspect of success.
Definitely. You know, biological networks and systems are extremely complex. And if we don't have this open mind, and if we're not willing to open our minds to different perspectives and look beyond familiarity, we don't advance, period. You had two major turning points in your career that led you to where you are today. First, you picked scientific research over medical school. And later, you focused on your research study. You focused it on the perception of pressure and pain. How did you navigate around these two pivotal points in your journey? What were you looking for, and what were you guided by?
You know, those are my two favorite topics in my scientific career to think about, because and this actually, the prize has given me the incentive to go back and examine this. And the reason I say this is because I feel that doing this biomedical research that I do is the perfect choice for me. I mean, I fit it very well. I enjoy it. I've said it before that even if I didn't get paid and I was independently wealthy, I would do this. And so the question is, and this is as relevant to me as to the new generation. And I have a 18-year-old son who's going to college. So how do you find your passion? How do you find your career? And this is a perfect example of how, for me, it occurred in a way rather randomly, because I was a pre-med student. That was kind of partly because, doing a PhD in science was not really available in Lebanon. So I liked sciences, and that was kind of the default. And the only reason I'm here is because I worked in a laboratory in my undergrad years just to get a good letter of recommendation. So the story goes that UCLA class sizes were large, 100 to 300 people. And I found it very difficult to know professors enough to ask them to write a letter of recommendation. So the only way to get around this, I thought, was to work in the lab. So I had no interest in the work in the lab. It was just to get a letter of recommendation. But the minute I was able to do this, I immediately fell in love with doing research, both the people, the culture, the way you think. And this led to the transition of shifting from being a pre-med to wanting to go to graduate school. So thinking back about this is, how could I have known, like, for it not to be so random? What advice would I give to kids today? And it's not easy. We don't yet have AI software that looks deep into your brain and says you should become this. And that's probably not a good thing anyways. So the only thing I can think of is expose yourself to as many experiences as you can, and don't rush into decisions. And that's really it. But I think there's so much focus in high school kids about what college they want to go to. This consumes everyone in high school. I would think everybody would be better served in exploring what would make them happy and how they could help society as a much more important question for them than the specific schools that they would want to go to.
Definitely, definitely.
And,
they have to be, yes, go ahead.
And with respect to the second question of the transition to why I studied this, it was actually abrupt transition. So I was studying how sensory neurons develop during embryogenesis. And this is a very important question. But I quickly realized that these sensory neurons that we work with, touch and pain neurons, do something that the rest of the body doesn't do. So most of the cells in our bodies communicate through chemicals, whether this is sensing hormone or sensing neurotransmitter. It's just chemicals going from one cell to another and talking to each other. But when you talk about temperature and pressure sensing, this is a completely new ballgame. We're talking about now cells communicating with each other through physical forces, such as temperature and pressure. And we just did not know how this is done at the molecular level. So many times in science, it's very important to focus on a question that is unanswered, that is very important. But at the same time, there's a practical aspect to it. Approach a question that can be answered within the next 10, 20 years. Don't pick something that there's no technologies to address it. So it's that combination of practicality, but also in a way, thinking big about what are the most important unanswered questions that would help both physiology and medicine.
Yes, that's a nice answer. Thank you. And down the road, you ended up at Scripps Research, where you identified Piezos. What are they? Can you tell us what they are? Where are they located? What do they do in the body? And why is their discovery considered a breakthrough in science?
So you did a good job introducing this in the beginning, but I'll go a little bit further. So I already mentioned that we need to translate these physical forces into an electrical signal that neurons understand. So neurons communicate through voltage, electrical signals. And so piezos are these proteins called ion channels. And in a way, they are very simple. So they sit at the outside of the cell, the membrane, and they are either closed or open. When they're closed, they're not doing anything. When they open, ions flow in, and this is sufficient to start the neuron firing, as we call it. And so these piezo ion channels specifically so you have sensory neurons in your back. They send these tiny processes to your hands. At the tips of your fingers, you have these ion channels sitting at the extension of the cell. And any mechanical force, such as touch or hammer hitting your finger, is enough to open these channels. Ions come in, and the cell fires. So when I say it like this, it's very simple, but they play a very fundamental role in our communication with the outside world. So it was decades ago that people figured out at the molecular level how we see, how we smell, but the sense of touch and pain kind of has been a mystery for decades, partly because they're so different than what other molecules or proteins do in the body.
Yes, and they are widespread in the body. They're not limited to a particular organ or part of the body. You talked about touch and pain and all that. How do we discriminate between different textures? I touch something smooth versus rough, or different pain intensities. Are these different kinds of piezos coming together, or different pathways, or maybe just an additive effect of the same receptor, or maybe an emerging effect of the same receptor?
Yeah. This is an age-old question in the field of pain and touch sensation. I don't want to get into the details, but from the most broader aspect, there is this labeled line theory is what we call it. And that is, there are specialized neurons that sense various aspects of somatosensation. So there's some neurons that only sense cooling. So when they fire, it tells your brain that I'm touching something cold, and how much they fire tells you how cold it is. So others are specific to some kind of touch. Others are what we call polymodal nociceptors, which only sense painful stimuli. But interestingly, piezos are expressed in various neurons involved in touch. And we still don't understand exactly how, but different neurons expressing piezos that have different anatomical distinctions come together to give us this rich sensation that we call touch.
And they are massive in size, unlike typical ones, right? These channels.
Yes.
And they're very conserved through evolution. Plants have the same kind that we use.
Yeah, that's been one of the more fascinating avenues, is that the same molecule evolved slightly differently, is present in flies, in worms, unicellular organisms, as well as you mentioned, plants. And we recently found that in plants, they're actually expressed at the root tip of plants. And, plants also have to sense pressure. They can, for example, as they're growing through the soil, come in contact with a harder soil or rock, and they have to sense this and go around it. And it seems like piezos in plants play a role in this process. So it's quite fascinating that throughout evolution, we've had the same protein be responsible for our sense of touch, and that plant behind me, how its roots navigate the soil.
Yes, it truly is fascinating. Science is in general. What are the therapeutic implications of your discovery? I know there are many. And what kind of drugs could develop from targeting piezo?
So the piezo 2 that's required for touch, I should say that this also gives the impression that not everything is solved. So if, for example, the acute pain sensation is due to yet another channel that we don't know. So if I hit a hammer on my fingers, as I said, I feel that immediate ouch. That is not piezo, and we don't know what it is. So we're still looking for it. Piezo 2 is involved in pain, in more actually inflammatory or neuropathic pain models when touch becomes painful. So there is actually very important clinical application. The idea is that if you block piezo 2, some forms of clinically relevant pains will be blocked, and we and others are working on this. But as you can imagine, since it is required for touch and feeling of where your limbs are in your body, this is, I don't think, ever going to be a drug where you take a pill, blocks piezo 2 all over your body, because it will have very strong, what we call on-target side effects. And so if there's any applications, which I think there is, it has to be more local antagonist blocking for areas that are inflamed or are suffering from neuropathic pain. But as you also said, although we were mainly interested in the sense of touch and pain, we found that piezos are also important for many other processes that we didn't even initially think about. So anything that has to do with pressure, it seems like piezos play a role. When your bladder is full and you sense that, that's piezo. Even in senses that you're not aware of. So for example, you have a system in your peripheral nervous system where you sense blood pressure, and if it increases, you immediately have a feedback loop to bring it back. It's like a thermostat. And again, this is something that piezos seem to be involved in, because obviously it has to do with pressure sensing. So one of the exciting avenues is that we're just finding out the biology now. And I think the potential translational work will come in the next 10 to 20 years, actually. And I don't know where it's going to come. I think the future research will show.
Yes. And there's big names like malaria, blood pressure, right? Involved. Yes. Also. And tens of different mutations in piezo 1 and piezo 2 have been already linked to different human disorders. Fascinating research is developing out of piezo's discovery. Now that you have all that figured out, what do you see yourself doing next? What's beyond the pressure of piezo?
It's a good question. Again, just like I answered my first question, this is a process. I'm trying to figure out where to go next. And I think one of the surprising news in a way is that usually the Nobel Prize is given to fields that were solved 10, 20 years ago. So although our initial discovery of piezo was 10 years ago, I feel like we're in the middle of still finding out what these ion channels do and what other aspects of mechanotransduction is important for physiology and disease. So the next 5 to 7 years is really to keep following and ask the question, both in human diseases and in physiology, what other aspects are dependent on mechanosensation, and piezos are kind of a key to open this door and try to find them. So in a way, we will continue doing what we've been doing in the next 5 years, and then we'll see.
Okay, we will check with you again. You mentioned a little bit, you talked about this a little, you discovered piezo in 2009. it was cloned. You cloned it in 2010. It took 11 years for it to get you the Nobel Prize. And then prior to that, you had identified transient receptor potential, TRPA1, and that was in 2003. It took almost 20 years to get it to phase 2 clinical trials for osteoarthritis and chronic low back pain. That's a real test of patience. What advice do you have for today's generation, which is one of instant gratification? Our kids expect things to happen fast, happen quickly, be more convenient. It's a problem we face with them on a daily basis. What's your word of advice?
I mean, that's an important point that you raised, that in biomedical research, people have to realize how difficult, time-consuming, and expensive this research is. And it does really take that time. Actually, what you mentioned is the average time. It's not even slower than average. And so this is something that the public needs to realize, that investment in basic research translates decades later. With respect to the new generation, I agree with you, but I also have, I try not to read too much into this. And let me explain. Of course, these kids these days are bombarded by technologies such as video games that are designed to get them hooked, and all the social media and stuff. I do worry as well about the next generation, of how much time they spend on their devices and not go out and experience things the way we did, in a way. But at the same time, I remember very distinctly how my parents thought our generation was a lost cause because we watched TV so much. And so I think this kind of happens at every generation, and every generation has their advantages and disadvantages they have to deal with. This new generation, despite what you said, also think much more freely. They're much more open about their feelings. And honestly, the way research is changing so much with artificial intelligence, etc., I don't know what scientist's job in the next generation will be, right? Lots of things that we do will be done through potentially AI in the future. And so maybe all these kids need to do is to think big and come up with the ideas, and the rest will be done for them. I don't want to get too futuristic here, but I think it's important to keep in mind that parents should be very careful about how kids are interacting these days and how the technology is influencing psychology and how they interact with the world. But we kind of have to also let this generation deal with these problems themselves.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for sharing that with us. Scientists are not only patient, but they also understand very well the importance of sharing and collaborating. And sometimes you have to reach out to labs that are thousands of miles away from you for materials, for protocols. And when you publish your work, you co-author with several professionals, sometimes 10 or 20 of them, each with his or her own different background, professional background, cultural background. Now, these interactions are exactly what allows science to propel forward and reach new frontiers. How crucial is it for the world today to come together and be willing to share knowledge and resources?
This is such a good point. And it's true that in general, science is done in a big group, and both within the laboratory, the institute, as well as these collaborations. And our work is, we don't come in and invent everything from the start. Our work is completely dependent on previous publications, previous generations. So it's a very collaborative kind of way of working. And particularly, I have to say, I am so proud of the scientific community on how they have responded to the COVID pandemic. Mm-hmm. This has been said many times before, but brand new virus, not knowing its identity, its sequence, to having drugs and vaccines, mm-hmm. could not have been possible without incredible collaboration and sharing of information that you talked about. I still remember in the first days where sequencing the virus was a priority, and it was done within weeks and shared with everybody so that everyone can start making drugs and vaccines to this. And this is so important. And I agree with you so much that if this kind of cooperation existed throughout society, it would be much better. The world will be a much better place. And especially because in biomedical research, you have to realize there are conflicting financial interests. I mean, university professors don't have much, perhaps, but these drugs that people are, making takes billions of dollars to make. And of course, they have to make lots of money to do this. And to find a way to still collaborate with this caveat is really important. And we in the biomedical research could use more of it as well. But I think you're right that it's a interesting case study for the rest of society.
Definitely, definitely. You've earned a powerful platform with your Nobel Prize that allows your voice to circle the planet. How do you plan to use your voice on global issues?
I'm of two minds here. One thing that's tugging at me is to say, ignore all this and just do your science. This is what you do best. This is what you love. Just keep doing that and ignore the rest. I think that's a little bit naive, but there is a lot of truth to that. So mainly I want to focus on that majority of my time stays exactly the same. I also honestly have a little bit of a problem with this where, I consider myself an ordinary scientist who all of a sudden now is expected to know things about everything, and my opinion should matter much more than before. And again, I'm a bit uneasy about this. I mean, I cherish it some level, but at the same time, I'm uneasy about it because I don't have expertise on everything. And I don't think my voice should be listened to in areas where I don't have expertise in. So having said that, again, I'm trying to balance this with trying to do some good. And I think, as I mentioned, it would be naive to say that I should ignore all of this. And again, when I hear from, people from Lebanon or Armenia saying, please come and visit, your story will inspire the next generation to do difficult things, to do science. It would be rather a shame for me to neglect that. And so, again, as I said, it's just it will be balance of trying to keep my life the way it was, but at the same time do a little bit to give back, especially to communities that have helped me. And so, again, if you ask me 2 years from now, the answer might be a little bit different because I'm getting used to this as well.
Yes.
But these are my thoughts right now.
Yes, thank you for sharing them. Certain scientific research and medical practices are controversial. They have caused quite a stir on a global level and led to heated debates about drawing the line on such practices. We heard about Doudna and Charpentier, the 2020 Nobel laureates in chemistry. They invented CRISPR, which is a gene editing tool. It can cut DNA with extreme precision and allows us to exchange disease-causing genes with healthy ones. Now, this has paramount positive impact on the future of medicine, but it can also be used to manipulate the genes to create things like designer babies. What are your thoughts on this?
I think, science, finds truth, they discover, right? And, but it's very important, of course, to control the application of these scientific discoveries. And CRISPR is a perfect example of how I think of it as a wonderful discovery. It has, people only think about how this will be used in gene therapy, for example, but it has truly revolutionized how we do science. It has impacted every lab, including ours, of how we get to new discoveries. So the most basic level, it's a great advancement of how we perform science. And this, of course, cannot be understated.
Mm.
But just like, molecular biology of cloning DNA, etc., was treated decades ago, it's very important for scientists to start having committees and deciding what is good and safe to do, what should not be done at this point. And actually, many countries and scientific organizations are heavily involved in this, and there are strict rules in US, for example, of what you can do and what you cannot do. There's nothing scary about this as long as scientists together with people in ethics and politicians come together and go forward in a organized, safe way. I think this is all positive. But as you know, as an example happened in China, where this was used in humans way before most scientists feel comfortable going in that direction. And so this kind of accentuates the importance of these steps I'm talking about to be at the global level instead of just local, because it is easy enough to do that. These kind of things will happen, and absolutely against that, of course, and that should be controlled by governments, and scientists have to be involved in this process, and I think they are. So I'm not super alarmed, but it's very important to keep at this and keep a strong eye on it.
Yes, definitely, and it's something that would affect humanity going forward. Thank you so much for answering all my questions, Dr. Patapoutian. Let's open the floor for the audience, shall we?
Sure.
Okay, for those who wish to ask Dr. Patapoutian a question, you can leave it in the chat box, or you can raise your hand using the reactions button on the bottom of the screen. I'm going to go ahead and start with one that I received via email from Fadil Faqih. He's asking you, do you think scientists should communicate their findings in simple terms to the general public instead of just limiting them to scientific journals?
I think the answer is, of course, yes, but to what extent, right? Science has, as it advances, becomes very technical, and it is absolutely essential for us to write and communicate this in a way that experts understand, because it's okay to describe the science in a way that everybody understands. It's essential, but the other side is also important. And the more and more I see many scientists are actually are involved. If you look at again, bring the example of COVID, and you go on Twitter, you see many epidemiologists have hundreds of thousands of followers, because obviously these are not just scientists. People are very interested on a day-to-day how this is evolving, how the virus is evolving, how our medications against it are acting. And so I think this is already happening. And again, Twitter is a great place for this kind of communication to happen. One has to be careful, because there's also a very negative side of Twitter. I know one of my colleagues at Scripps who was giving all this current information of how things are going for the fight against COVID. And he got lots of abusive comments, and he had to get out of Twitter. So for scientists, this is a major investment. So the public should know that to spend time communicating with the public. And I wish everybody would treat this with some courtesy, and because there's lots of negativity out there as well that could make this communication difficult to do. But of course, I'm all for communicating to the public. In the US, most of medical funding comes from the NIH, which is from the government. And so that's paid for taxpayers. And so they, of course, have the right to know what's going on, and they should understand it.
We have a question from Apurv Kochara. Go ahead, Apurv.
Hello. I'm Apurva Kochara from India. Hello to everyone, and His Excellence Dr. Ardem sir. Sir, my question is that how can I make my career in clinical research along with my medical practice?
So I don't know exactly how the process works in India. I think people who are in the medical track in the US have a couple of options. You know, they can do MD, PhD, which is getting both degrees in biomedical research as well as MD, and then go on to either go into the clinic or research or both. There are many physician scientists in the United States that actually split their time. I also know people who never bothered getting a PhD, just with their medical degree, got some experience in a laboratory, and just ended up doing mainly research, one day of clinical work. So there's more and more overlap between medical work and research, and I think there are many opportunities. But if you're interested, I would say get into a lab and get some experience is the first step.
So, sir, it will be a good approach to approach any laboratory in different countries and along with my medical practice, because currently I'm preparing for the pleb examination for the UK. So I want to go UK and pursue my medical career over there along with my research, sir.
Definitely possible. I don't want to give you the impression that it would be easy. Laboratories usually don't hire people unless they have some experience, but you know, you have to keep trying and persevere.
Thank you for taking that question. We have one from Nelly Regina. What are the 3 best tips for having a successful career in science and balancing your personal life?
You know, as I've seen my trainees, students and postdocs through my lab, the keys to, I think, success in science are what almost looks like 2 contradictory characteristics. One is to be a dreamer in a way, to think big, to think outside the box, to imagine finding a solution using a method that no one has tried before. So to have this courage to do it your own way, to do it differently. But juxtaposed with this, you also need practicality to know what will work and what will not work. And the best way to do that in science is to have exquisite knowledge of what's been done before you. And that comes from reading scientific literature, going to conferences, etc. So within science, I feel like it's this combination. And just to add a third to answer your question of, you know, life and work balance, you know, I worked very hard in a laboratory as a graduate student and as a postdoc, working late into the night, overnight sometimes, and weekends all the time. But as I became a professor, I realized that my job is less to spend number of hours and more to think big. And one of the nicest things about science is that I don't need to be in a laboratory setting to think. I've actually said this before, that I'm a runner, and most of my good ideas have come to me while I'm running. And so that's the beauty of science, is that you can do this while on a hike with your family or on a camping trip. And so, you know, I think I find, and some people don't, but I find the work-life balance in science actually easy, because there's less limitations on physical hours in a laboratory. Don't get me wrong, there is some, you have to write grants, you have to write papers, you have to talk to your students and postdocs and teach, but overall, it allows for this, it's a luxury.
Mm-hmm. You have one from Farid Makarim. He's saying, how will patients benefit physically from your theories regarding pain?
I think, before I talk about pain, I think one of the great things about the discovery, I'll give you an example. So we talked about how piezo2 is required for touch and proprioception, this sense of where your body is. And actually, human patients who do not have piezo2 were misdiagnosed in the clinic, because they learn to walk very late in life. Some people are wheelchair bound, and they have major coordination problems. And when they went to the doctor initially, they all thought they had muscle problems or motor neuron problems. After sequencing and finding that they're deficient in piezo2, And looking at our work, they've realized, of course, that this is the deficiency in touch and proprioception. And so just simple, this knowledge is already starting to help these people, because if you understand your condition, you can work around it. So for example, these patients will be able to walk if they realize that they're not getting this feedback from the lens, and they should use their visual system to compensate for this lack of proprioception. So just knowledge simply without drugs already helps patients in the clinic. But the thing that I'm excited about, again, we showed this both in mouse and in humans, is that tactile allodynia, which is, I mentioned this, when touch becomes painful, is a serious problem for folks suffering from neuropathic pain, where just the touch or wearing a shirt in a certain area of your body is painful. So we have data from these patients that if you don't have piezo2, then you don't have tactile allodynia. So just a one jump away from saying that if we had a way to, let's say you have pain in your knees that is related to tactile allodynia, and if we had a way to inhibit piezo2 specifically there, then it might help you for pain. So that's the idea. It's not there, of course, but this is what we and others are working towards.
That's great. That's great work altogether. Nijad Al-Atasi would like to ask you a question directly. Go ahead, Nijad. Nijad, you need to unmute yourself. You need to press unmute.
Yeah, I did it, but I'm sorry. It again came up. Thank you, Dr. Hasniya. Thank you for this session. Great. First, I would like congratulations to Dr. Patapoutian on your Nobel Prize. It's really proud for all of us. Just, as I understand, you did your research, for the human being, okay? And that means, in your research, did you work on animals?
So our work in the lab is in many aspects. So lots of the work we do are what we call molecular biology. We're just dealing with DNA, and we're dealing with cell culture, the cells that you can culture in a dish. We do things like electrophysiology, record from these cells. We do structural biology. We take these molecules and use these massive microscopes to look at what structure they have. We also use some animal models to study physiology, what they're good for, but we also collaborate with clinicians directly for the consequences of these genes being up or down regulated in humans. So we use many different approaches in the lab to study.
Thank you. Thank you for answering this. I'm gonna take one final note from Mona Maroon. She's saying this is the most powerful expertise aside from your wonderful science, being a role model for Lebanese and Armenian young generations to make them dream that it is possible. What a wonderful interview, very modest and yet as huge as the Nobel Prize.
Thank you.
Dr. Patapoutian, maybe we need to end the session here so that we can get you out of here in a few minutes. Anything else you'd like to add?
I think you covered everything important to talk about, both on the science side and the human side. Just want to thank you, and again, thanks for all the support and comments like you just mentioned. It still puts me off guard to interesting thought is this, the immigrant story. Of course, I knew this was my story. I live with it. And before this, I really never, ever thought that this was an inspiring story. It's just because you live with it, it's part of you. I would say almost to the other side, where I was a bit anxious that my name, Patapoutian, is not easy to pronounce, and how would people respond to it? This experience has really kind of flipped that on itself, where I'm kind of proud of this, proud to have people be exposed to different cultures, different names. And again, the positive response that I've gotten from everyone just gives me more confidence to use this as a platform, as you said, for other kids not to feel anxious about their quote unquote different names. And So anyways, that's the final message, I guess. But thank you for the kind words, and thanks for the great questions.
Been a pleasure. Thank you. To everyone in the audience, I am so grateful you joined us today. Please don't forget to connect with us again. Unheard Stories is a monthly event. It falls on the last Saturday of every month. Our next episode is scheduled for Saturday, February 26th, and my guest will be Dr. Charles Elachi, former director of JPL and VP of Caltech. He oversaw more than 20 space missions and led JPL and NASA to become the world leaders in the field of spaceborne imaging radars. Dr. Elachi is currently Professor Emeritus at Caltech in Electrical Engineering and Planetary Science. He continues to work as a science investigator on a number of missions across the solar system. He received many national and international awards. We will be turning our eyes to the skies with Dr. Elachi. You don't want to miss it. To watch past events and know about our future ones, you can follow me on social media. Thank you for bringing us into your home and making us part of your Saturday. Goodbye, everyone.